Good evening and welcome to tonight's event. Tonight's program, Project a Performance Lecture on the Mental Architecture of Magic, will be presented by artist, magician, and National Arts Club fellow, Jeanette Andrews. She will combine performances of pieces of magic with overhead projections and philosophical conversation to investigate how and why we perceive and believe in the seemingly impossible. While there will be no formal Q&A as part of tonight's program, Jeanette would love to talk with you afterwards. A little about Jeanette. Jeanette Andrews is an artist, magician, and speaker, and hailed as one of the most innovative illusionists in the world today. She has staged hundreds of sold-out and standing room-only performances and talks for Fortune 500 companies, universities, and social events. She has presented commissioned works, talks, and performances with the Smithsonian's Cooper Hewitt, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, MIT, Columbia, and Harvard. She is, as I said, a National Arts Club fellow and a recent affiliate of Harvard's Meta Lab. Her performances have been praised by the Chicago Tribune, PBS, and the New York Times. So please welcome Jeanette Andrews.
And now you don't. Magic allows us to challenge our assumptions and question possibilities for a world beyond. It's one of the things I find the most deeply beautiful about it. It allows us to ask some of the most basic questions, most seemingly basic questions, about the fundamental properties of the objects around us. Like if the color red that I see is the same as the color red that you see. This was actually the question that got me most interested in kind of thinking about how magic and perception and philosophy and science and all these things sort of overlap. Was how magic a lot of times does give us these opportunities to ask these sorts of questions. Because essentially, when we think about it, something like color that seems fairly pedestrian, this is something that actually we really kind of don't really think about that deeply. When in fact, the color red is actually, we have white light kind of bouncing all around us, and it's the color red that's being reflected back at us. But a lot of times we're not really thinking about this until we have something like a tool that kind of shows us, that can kind of fracture open our experience in some way. Something almost like a prism. I feel like magic a lot of times acts almost like a perceptual prism that shows us and opens up and splits open the gaps within our perception to show that it is this larger continuum of what we think and what we think may be there. It also allows us to question these fundamental properties not only in terms of color, but in terms of the materiality of things. Something like glass that we're so familiar with, that we think we know. And that, for example, when we see it in a prism, this is something that we're so kind of used to seeing, but that it does, in fact, sort of split open our experience. And the idea that glass is so good at doing that because it bends light and refracts light in such a beautiful way. But yet, we understand that glass is quite fragile. Glass will shatter. This also brings to mind, I think, one of the first experiences, one of the first brushes many of us have with the world of illusion as children, where we take a glass, fill it with water about half full, and drop in a pen or a pencil or a marker, and it looks bent or broken or distorted in some way. There's an odd tension that happens in the world of illusions. And with this in particular, it shows us how we have essentially things as we're used to seeing and understanding them in our daily life, these two different objects, and then as they come together to create something that seems new and yet odd and kind of familiar at the same time. So what happens when in illusion this tension starts to crystallize? And we know that glass will shatter and it won't bend. The glass is yours to keep.
Thank you.
Magic possesses a unique structure for belief in the seemingly impossible. And this is what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about. I will be very honest, we're only going to cover 3 aspects of this because otherwise I would be here for like 9,000 hours talking to you. And even within these 3, I will be very honest, it was really, really, really hard to boil it down. So, we're going to start out with the cultural frame of the magic performance. And within that, we'll talk about magic's near neighbors and magic as a bracketed experience. So it seems somewhat helpful for our time today to actually start off with a definition of magic. I'm a sucker for a definition, as I know are some people here today. This one is coming to us by way of Google Arts and Culture, which, whatever. But honestly, their definition of magic is quite good for our purposes today. They define magic as a performing art in which audiences are entertained by tricks, effects, or illusions of the seemingly impossible using natural means. Okay, so this, in a lot of ways, seems really simple, and yet there's so much packed into this. So we'll kind of talk about a couple of parts of this in particular, and one of which we're going to start out by talking about how it's a performance, and then also how it's tricks and by natural means. Those are kind of the 3 aspects that we'll focus on. So we'll start out with the idea of the magic show, because essentially, when you come to a magic show, you know you're watching a performance. That's a very specific frame. It's a very specific cultural frame of understanding. If anybody here is a fan of the sociologist Irving Goffman, sort of in his frame analysis, performing the self, etc., the frame of a show, we understand that what you're seeing here is a performance. I'm not claiming to be doing something by supernatural means. I'm also not doing something that's sort of firmly rooted in the natural world. You understand you're seeing a fabricated series of events that are unfolding in a planned way. And then we think about magic's kind of main colloquialism of seeing a magic trick, which in and of itself defines exactly what's going on, is that you know you're being tricked, which is a really weird thing to participate in. It really is. This is a really, magic is a really, really unusual form for a number of reasons. Because here, magic, we are explicitly telling you, by the very fact that you're coming to a magic performance, you know you're going to be deceived, and then you hopefully are. Which, again, that's just a really odd, unusual form of something to participate in. So what's interesting about that is because of that, we as magicians essentially are transparent about the fact that we're deceiving you, which again is odd. So basically we have sort of this transparent deception happening. And yet, you all are choosing to participate in this. So by the very nature that we're being transparent about it, that gives you the opportunity to consent to be part of a deception. Myself and another fellow magician kind of both independently kind of use this term of magic as a consensual deception. That's me and Matthew Holtzclaw, if anybody follows his work. But so magic is sort of this weird consensual deception. So right now we'll talk about a couple aspects, getting a little further into the idea of the magic show and how that works within cultural framing. So for our examples talking about this, we'll talk about the magic show as with one particular trick, which is what many of you, I'm sure, by the very fact that you're here, are all familiar with, which is sort of the age-old cups and balls magic trick, right? So let's imagine you're watching a magician do the cups and balls magic trick, right? You know you're watching a show, you know you're watching a magic show, you know you're being deceived and you're going to be. So there's a couple of aspects of that we'll focus on, which are the fact that you know, we're having something's happening. I don't know. The fact that essentially by watching a magic show, let's be very real, the stakes are really low. I'm not operating on anybody. This is a very low stakes situation. And yet, weirdly, your level of scrutiny is really, really high for something with low stakes because of the fact that you know you're going to be deceived. So you're watching really, really closely. So you have this kind of weird thing of having low stakes and high scrutiny. Because magic is happening both within kind of the real world and the fictional world at the same time. Because you know you're watching a performance, and yet it's also not really kind of acting in a totally fictional world, which is why when we think about one of Magic's near neighbors, we'll think about magic within the context of a play. So if you think about now seeing the exact, maybe even the same person doing the cups and balls magic trick, they're wearing the same thing, they're saying the same words, everything is the same, but now they're doing it within the context of a play. Now, suddenly, the end goal is different. Usually it's to advance a narrative plot, character arc, etc. And now it's fully framed within a fictional world. So again, you sort of have low stakes. Sorry, that's just real. And also low scrutiny. Because imagine if I go and I see Peter Pan, and I see, Tinkerbell fly, and I see essentially the wires of her flying. The entire experience of Peter Pan is not ruined for me. I don't lose the whole point of the story, right? As opposed to with magic, you kind of do. So that's a very different thing that's happening there because sort of the ends are different and it's fully framed within this fictional world. Let's then think of our last example, which is you're watching a person doing the exact same gestures, you're watching them do with the same props, or maybe even saying the same words. But now you're watching this on the street, and you're watching this, and now there's money on the line. Now you're participating in gambling. And so now, if you're seeing the same thing happen, now that deception is not transparent to you, and now you're part of a con. So the stakes are higher because there's your money on the line. Your scrutiny is higher because the stakes are higher. And this is fully bracketed within the experience of the real world. And yet, because there's not that transparency about what's going on, that's why this is sort of like a real deception that's happening. So I think it's helpful, at least for me, when I think about kind of the way in which how we kind of think about magic, ooh, thank you, that when we even just compare these three things, how different we see that even doing the same person, doing the same gestures and saying the same words might be completely different and exist within this really unusual, hazy form when it's framed as a magic show. As part of this, we'll talk about magic as bracketed experience. I'm going to kind of fangirl over my newest philosophical love, which is from Tichy Nguyen, who's at University of Arizona. And he does a lot on studying game theory and also on hostile epistemology, which we'll come back to later. But he talks about games a lot, and he talks about how games give us this capacity to fail in a safe space. And that essentially he talks about how games act as a magic circle where essentially the meanings of them don't cross out into the real world. So you can fail in the game and not fail in real life. Magic acts as a similar way. I think magic is also kind of this type of bracketed experience because essentially you're getting to have essentially the permission within this very narrow confines to experience perceptual failure, which again is something that is really unusual to experience, and yet magic affords us a way to experience this in kind of a safe way. It's very different than if you saw, let's say for example, if I'm in the grocery store and I see somebody pick up an apple and it's red, and then they pick it up and it's green, I'm probably gonna like go to the ER. Like seriously. As where here you're just like, oh okay, another Tuesday. So magic is really odd in that sense. And so I think that's why magic kind of gives us this like mental playground to test and challenge our own perceptions and assumptions and think about how these things can be challenged. I think it's also when we think about the perceptual aspect of it, one other thing that Nguyen talks about is the idea of kind of bracketed loss of control. He talks about carnival rides, and he talks about a lot of times how people who enjoy carnival rides do so because it is this controlled loss of control. And magic, I would argue, is a controlled perceptual loss of control. So that brings us to our next part of this. So we kind of talked about the frame, and now we'll talk about the idea of perception's role. And again, I'm just going to cover two really minor points on this because seriously, we'd be here like 20 years. So basically, we'll kind of talk about magic and how that exists in the gaps of our perceptions and how magicians a lot of times provide scaffolding to experience this. So to continue on with some of Nguyen's thoughts, he coined this phrase, hostile epistemology, which is basically talking about the idea of how, essentially, and everything here is a little crazy, but essentially hostile epistemology is the study of ways in which environmental features exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities. We are all perceiving too much, too often to be able to genuinely, actively perceive everything all the time. We just can't do it. I mean, like even right now, I'm looking at 150 different faces. I cannot mentally, any person cannot mentally compute all of that information at one time. The visual acuity you have, if nothing else, that you can actually see in sharp focus is anywhere between 2 to 5 degrees. So that's like about the width of your thumb that you could actually genuinely see in sharp focus. So your brain a lot of times is sort of filling in the missing gaps of what is there. And that's a lot of times what magic does and what magic does best. It is exploiting the fact that we have these gaps in our perception to point out that they exist. No, this is real. He's like, check it out. No, it's between 1 and 5. Most studies say 2. But yes, so the idea that essentially all of us are kind of limited cognitive beings and we're seeing the world kind of in these slices and in these patches, and then we as one person are within this one patch, and we have to link everything up from our limited patch. So that linking up, that process of linking up, a lot of times that's where the magician swoops in and hopefully does something interesting. Greg Jones is an anthropologist who is at MIT. I'm currently working on a collaboration with him. He's amazing. Everybody in this audience, I think, would love his books. He's got 2, Magic's Reason and Trade of the Tricks. Trade of the Tricks is about the community of secrecy amongst magicians. And this is a quote from it where he talks about how magicians have developed an elaborate working understanding of the mainsprings of perception. And then kind of with a corresponding repertoire of sleight of hand techniques to essentially induce perceptual error. So, like I was saying before, there's so much going on around us that we have to be taking all these mental shortcuts. We're having to categorize things. So, when we think about things like this, we don't, let's say for example, when you drink something out of a glass, every single time you pick up a glass and drink something out of it, you're not actively thinking about how to pick that up, how to lift it up, how to bring it to your mouth. You're usually not doing that. Obviously, there's anomalies for this, but usually, and we're also not thinking about what the glass is. We're putting it within a category of like things that get drink out of, you know, a coffee mug, a cup, anything, right? And so everything sort of fits within this one category, and then we move forward and live our lives accordingly. And it's the same way, again, even when we think about things like color. That's how a lot of times through a lot of these perceptual qualities that we're making things that then fit into these categories so we can take all these mental shortcuts so that we're not having to use our limited, essentially kind of metabolic capacity that we have to fuel our brain to be perceiving everything. So basically, let's say, for example, again, back to our apples, if you saw, we know apples are usually along some spectrum of red or green. If you saw a spherical piece of fruit that was orange, you would maybe categorize it as an orange. Or if it was, dark purple, maybe it's a plum. You know what I mean? Like there's all these just really basic assumptions that we make about things every day. And that's a lot of times what magic is really interested in kind of pointing out, because a lot of times by categorizing things, we are within those categories, we're making predictions that we're pushing forward. And then where the brain is acting as this prediction model because of this sort of pattern recognition. It's a Lisa Feldman Barrett thing for anybody interested in her work. So because of this, because of all the assumptions and mental shortcuts you're making, I would definitely argue that magic a lot of times occurs in the filled-in gaps in the minds of the people watching it. And so we as magicians, we know what end effect we want you to perceive. And so essentially we know, sort of back to our architectural analogy, we know what the end shape of the building is that we want for you. I'm also really embarrassed because there's an architect in the front row who's looking at me. Sorry, Kate. You can correct me on everything later. So basically, as a magician, we are oftentimes building out a performance that is carefully designed, essentially, to fabricate the end effect we want you to perceive, and we're kind of making this scaffolded structure around sort of this empty shell of what we know we want you to see and what we want you to think. And where we want you to fill in and make these mental gaps. So a lot of times magic is sort of giving you essentially almost these touchstones to kind of make either visual, perceptual, or cognitive jumps from sort of a stable point to another stable point, and then fill in the gap in between. So a lot of times when you're making those inferences, making those mental or visual jumps and assumptions and predictions, a lot of times that's where the magic is happening. Either times when things are just getting totally glossed over, times where maybe information is completely missing that you're filling in and missing and thinking is there, like the sort of missing note analogy that I think many of you are probably familiar with. And so this is why, going back to Graham Jones' thing, that we as magicians have to be really, really aware of all of the aspects of perception, and then which things viewers of magic are more likely to gloss over, and which things people are likely to be skeptical of. And then it's in this way that essentially we kind of build extra support beams on either sides of that. So we know, okay, here's some piece of information that is either people are more likely to be skeptical of, so I need to kind of bracket that with something on either side so that it maintains people's expectations, or if something is innocuous, we know it's not going to have extra scrutiny, then we just let it be. And a lot of times that's where things kind of get glossed over. And this, because of the fact that we're very carefully doing this with all of these touchstones and checkpoints and things, this a lot of times is where you feel a sense of clarity, where maybe we are giving you the false sense of clarity or an illusion of clarity that can help build a sense of trust. And this is our last thing for the day. So we'll talk about how kind of the role of trust via kind of thinking about how clarity, essentially kind of climbing the stairs of clarity up from perception over to the idea of the extended self and certainty. Okay, so this is another thing from Nguyen talking about the illusion of clarity as a thought ender. He talks about how when things seem clear, it's a signal to us that something is probably thought through enough. It's a heuristic that we use, as many of these kind of rules of thumb are. When something is unexpected and confusing, it's usually a rule for us to keep investigating in some way. There's something we don't understand, something that's confusing, and then clarity is usually a signal that we've investigated enough. And interestingly, in one of his talks, he actually talks about magic and stage magicians, and he talks about how stage magicians send signals of boring and interesting, and he literally does that hand gesture. And he talks about how the things that are boring versus the interesting, things that are interesting are confusing to think about, or again, kind of prompt further investigation, or versus things that are boring feel clear and settled. And this makes us think about the idea of certainty, and how certainty, essentially, is a lot of times you feel certain about watching things. And that's because this clarity that you feel gives you a sense of feeling certain, because we are used to essentially trusting our own perceptions of things. Right? I mean, I have all the different little rules of thumbs and all the different expectations and all the things that allow me to navigate life on a daily basis. So I trust my own perception. And historically, this has worked out for me. And so, I mean, for all of us, I hope. I'm just being honest. But the U was the royal U. But then we think about something like communal trust. We think about the fact that in a performance, you're watching with other people. So now, essentially, you have a whole bunch of other sets of eyes on what is going on, that essentially you have multiple views, literally and figuratively, of the same thing. And so essentially, the reactions of others are sort of emblematic in some way of their own, perhaps, internal perceptions. So, like, for example, Samantha, right? So, like, when Samantha's here, she's reacting in a way that hopefully is also kind of mirroring your perceptions of things about what you think may or may not be possible. And then that's all kind of lining up, right? And so then a lot of times also when we watch magic performance and a member of the audience is involved, essentially that is also acting as that extended self. The member of the audience is acting on your perceptual behalf to then be in the performance. So this is then kind of this idea. Annette Beyer wrote one of the most widely cited papers on trust in kind of our modern times, where she talks about one of these ideas of a communal sense of trust is making yourself vulnerable by putting something in another's goodwill. And so I think magic is a major display of this sort of reciprocal epistemic trust, how we know and how we come to forms of knowledge, because essentially the magician is putting our own deception up to your scrutiny, and is kind of vulnerable. That's sort of our vulnerability in that way, because we're saying, hey, we're deceiving you, and then you may catch us out for that. And then essentially the person watching it is also putting up your ability to be deceived. For somebody who, again, in the words of Nguyen, a hostile epistemic actor, aka me, I really should make business cards that say that. Essentially, it's kind of taking advantage of those mental shortcuts. And I think this is a lot of times why we feel conflicted or confused or challenged when watching magic. So, as kind of our last, essentially, kind of postscript, not a postscript, which is, for magic, are you actually believing in something that is impossible? Maybe, maybe not. So I would love to then talk about, this is my other favorite contemporary philosopher, Tamar Gendler. She's the Dean of Philosophy and Humanities at Yale and a dear friend. And she talks about the idea of a leaf, which is a phrase that she coined, which is basically an automatic mental state that is sort of in conflict with your rational beliefs. So her main example of talking about this is the idea of, she talks about going to, I think it's the one at the Grand Canyon, the Glass Bottom Horseshoe Observatory, where she talks about watching person after person after person walk out on that thing and just like crawling the side, just clinging onto it and stuff. When in fact, rationally, we know that's safe. Rationally, we know that there was like millions and millions of dollars and a team of architects, structural engineers, and all kinds of people working on this thing. Because if, for example, you rationally thought it wasn't safe, like if I walked to the edge of the Grand Canyon and I saw a piece of glass that was like held up by a twig, you'd be like, no way. But so we know it's safe, and yet when we walk out, there's that visceral response that is in conflict with our like conscious, rational beliefs. So you're holding two things that are sort of in tension with each other. And so this appears to be a big thing at play in magic, is that you're believing one thing and sort of leaving another. Because I am exactly as nerdy as you think I am. If anybody's interested in my sources, you all can also find all the slides for this if you want, which is just my website and then project, or project, but there goes. So that's the info for this. But as just a quick recap, essentially I think magic is really interesting because a lot of times it is rendering the full structure of the seemingly impossible in the mind of people watching through these couple of interesting mechanisms. The frame of the magic performance, where we as magicians are transparent about what we're showing you, you're consensually entering into that deception, and then things are kind of existing within that bracketed deception. The idea of the perceptual loss of control, and the idea that as within that, then you are filling in those gaps via this scaffolded structure that we as magicians have carefully created, these touchstones and these jumping points and landing points for you to make all of these perceptual assumptions the way that we want you to. And then within the idea of trust, that you are trusting me as somebody to deceive you, and then I do. And then within your own perceptions and within the communal sense of the others watching you as that extended self. So that's just a couple of the thoughts on, I think, how and why magic allows us to believe in the seemingly impossible, even for a moment. I have two last things. One of which is that I just want to say thank you so much to Laura, to the Roundtable Committee, to the National Arts Club for having me here, because it's just been such a great privilege and great joy. Thank you. I'm going to try this one more time. Nope, we're not going to go. Okay. I got to try. I have one last piece of magic to show you, but before I do, namely, I just want to thank all of you. Because sort of in this reciprocal moment of trust, you've given me the greatest bargaining chip that you had, which was your time and your attention. And I really don't take that lightly, especially for something as unusual as magic. And for me, I know one of the things that I think that is really special about people who enjoy watching magic or are interested in it is I feel like it's usually people who are open to experience and willing to have their perceptions and assumptions challenged. So I just want to thank you all so much for being here and for being curious with me. Are you certain